I'm thrilled that we have such a good audience today. I warned Sarah that it's the last day of the semester, but also there was a lot of buzz I know about how interesting this talk was going to be, so that's great. I'm Mira Levinson. I'm one of the co-conveners of the Civic and Moral Education Initiative, which is an initiative here at the Ed School and across Harvard to address issues of civic and moral education and all their complexity in sort of a wide variety of ways. We have this colloquium series, of which this is the last for this semester. We also have an occasional film series, and we have a student seminar series, as well as a doctoral program that we have for a scholars program that trains doctoral students in the new civics. And so I'm saying all this because I'm seeing some new faces. I hope, Julie, do we have our sign-up sheet?
We do.
Great, we will have a sign-up sheet go around. As always, please sign up even if you know that you've been on our list 27,000 times because it helps give us a count. But then also, if you are not actually on our email list, please give us your email if you're willing to be contacted. We promise that we don't send out more than a couple of emails a month, but it's a good listserv for finding out about job opportunities, research opportunities, publications, conference calls for papers, and other initiatives that are going on around civic and moral education. Just as a preview before I introduce Sarah for today, this next semester, in the spring, we have a really good lineup for the colloquium series. We have Larry Blum, who's going to be talking about his work on race and civic, teaching high school kids about race, actually at Cambridge Trinity Latin School down the street. He has a wonderful book that came out last year, Race Education in American High Schools, so it's not quite its name, but he'll be talking about that. We have, actually, who else is on our lineup? Oh, I will be talking about justice in schools, my research project next semester.
We have Irvin Staub as well.
Oh yeah, Irvin Staub is going to be talking about work on Israel and Palestine and education about sort of thinking about issues of conflict in Israel and Palestine. And we have a few others lined up too, and we have a really terrific third installment in our film series at the end of January, a film about Pussy Riot, the band that obviously got themselves incarcerated in Russia. And we also have some student seminar presentations taking place next semester too. So keep on joining us. For today, I'm really, really thrilled that we have Sarah Kavanagh talking to us about justice in practice towards practice-based teacher education for social justice teaching. I met Sarah when she was on a panel at ARA last year and was just totally blown away by the work and so invited her to come. It worked well because she was coming to visit family for Thanksgiving, so we were able to ride on that for the post-Thanksgiving bubble. But it was just really exciting stuff that I thought that would be great about here. Sarah's finishing her doctorate at University of Washington in teacher education and multicultural education. She's writing her dissertation actually not on this topic, but on teachers in secondary schools who are attempting to do supportive work with LGBTQ teens, which also is fascinating. We're talking about it over lunch. She taught in San Francisco and Baltimore for 4 years, middle school and high school history and English. And while she was doing that work, as well as, not while she was doing that work, she was the history and civics writer for the New York Times' Learning Network, which is one of their sort of online resources as part of the Times. So she has really interesting background. She also teaches the Humanities Methods course for teacher education students and has taught multicultural education to teacher education students. So with that, we welcome Sarah.
Thanks so much for that. It's great to be here. And all of your colloquia coming up sounds so exciting. I wish I could just stay out here. Also, I wish I could stay out here because it's beautiful and sunny, unlike in Seattle pretty much any of the time. So I'm excited to talk with you today a little bit about some of the work at the University of Washington around teacher education pedagogy. And this talk, in a lot of ways, is a little bit self-serving because I exist in two worlds at the University of Washington, both in pre-service teacher education, but they seem very sort of disparate to me. One is the world of social justice teacher education, and you heard a little bit about that in my introduction. I teach the multicultural education courses. My own research is investigating a traditionally oppressed group and how teachers work with that group to sort of interrupt some of those disparities. So that's one of the worlds that I work in. In the other world in which I work, at the University of Washington in pre-service teacher education, I'm really focused on practice-based teacher education. So in that world, I do methods teaching, and we talk a lot about core practices of teaching. And both of these worlds are focused a lot on how is it that we get novice teachers to do ambitious work inside classrooms. But they both enter the work from really different perspectives. So inside the work of myself and my colleagues in the world of social justice, we're constantly kind of asking the question, how do we prepare teachers to interrupt inequitable disparities that have arisen out of histories of oppression? That's sort of the main question that we're motivated by. And inside my work with my other set of colleagues at the University of Washington, we're motivated by a different question. How do we prepare teachers to enact teaching practices in ways that deepen students' understanding of content? Now, these are two questions that obviously have a really significant overlap, but because they are the entry point to our work with novice teachers, oftentimes when we try to have conversations about social justice with folks from practice-based teacher education world, we sort of speak across one another. We speak past one another because we have these really different entry points into the conversation. So, in part, to sort of make myself feel like I have less of a split personality, I've tried to meld these two questions into one motivating question for myself, which is going to be the subject of this talk. So the way I've begun to voice this, and hopefully you'll see the ways in which it's sort of informed by both of those two worlds, is how might we better prepare novices to enact teaching practices that interrupt inequitable disparities that have arisen out of histories of oppression. And you'll notice that the word enact is like triply emphasized. I bolded it, and underlined it, and italicized it. And the reason for that, if any of you have done work with novice teachers related to justice, is that enactment is an incredibly difficult thing to achieve, especially around something as sort of complex as the work of interrupting inequitable disparities or moving towards justice. And the reason I've bolded it here in some ways is because I'm so informed by the work of practice-based teacher education, which has mostly arisen out of the content area, so in mathematics education and ELA teaching, etc. The core practices work in practice-based teacher education inside methods courses has arisen out of the sort of long history of talking about the problem of enactment, right, which Mary Kennedy talked to us about in the 90s. Here, let me go back a second. So that problem of enactment being the gap between what teachers can envision being able to do and what they actually can accomplish, especially really early in their careers. So the folks who are working in practice-based teacher education have come up with some really pretty exciting, innovative ways to address the problem of enactment. And that work inside teacher education has been happening now for the past 20 years or so. And the folks who work inside teacher education, in practice-based teacher ed, oftentimes talk about practice-based teacher education, but it's such an emerging idea that it's kind of ill-defined, right? So you might hear people talking about practice-based teacher ed in one place and another place, and actually what they're talking about has almost nothing in common with each other, and that's because it's an emergent idea. I like to think about practice-based teacher education as existing inside of three major camps. So folks who are naming their work practice-based teacher education currently are either doing one or all of these things. They're either rethinking the curriculum of teacher ed to focus on actually getting teachers to enact ambitious practices of teaching, or they are rethinking the pedagogy of teacher education. So instead of stand and deliver models of coursework for pre-service teachers, or discussion-based models of coursework for pre-service teachers, teacher educators are beginning to take on pedagogies of enactment. They're having novices rehearse the work of teaching. They're having novices videotape their own teaching and analyze those videotapes. They're working with artifacts of teaching itself to engage novices in the learning of teaching. Or folks who talk about doing practice-based teacher education are actually rethinking the where, the settings of teacher ed. So you'll often see people who say they're doing practice-based teacher education who have moved the location of their work outside of the university and into K-12 schools themselves. where they might have kids come into the teacher ed classroom and have novices work with those kids in a setting that can be guided by teacher educators. So all three of these things currently in the field are being discussed as practice-based, and some people are doing all three at the same time, some people are just doing one, but I think these are the major camps. So part of what I want to talk about today is the ways, and most of this work is happening inside content-specific methods. So when people talk about redefining the curriculum or the pedagogy or the setting of teacher ed, most of those people exist inside the world of mathematics methods or science methods. And those of us who do our work in coursework like multicultural education courses or other courses that are really focused on working with novices to understand issues of power and identity, those of us who exist in that world have been sort of less tapped in a little bit to this move in teacher ed. And because I have existed so much in both of these worlds at the University of Washington, it's been a little bit of a task for me to think through, well, how is it actually that these two things can speak to one another? In part because I think the problem of enactment that we talked about here is particularly relevant to the work of preparing teachers to do justice work. Anybody who has worked with novices to think about justice and begin to prepare them to do justice work in schools has found that some of these people have really ambitious ideas and exciting, sophisticated ways of thinking about injustice and inequity, but often get into schools early in their careers and feel really paralyzed and unable actually to do the work. So I think that those of us who do the work of preparing novices to do social justice work have a lot to learn from the folks who have been experimenting with pedagogies of enactment and different curricula and settings for teacher ed. So my work, both at the University of Washington and sort of some conceptual work that I'm doing, has been really informed by both of these worlds, the world of justice and the world of practice. Now, before anyone could actually say, oh, I'm going to prepare novices to go do the work of social justice in practice, before you could redefine the where or the how or the what that you're actually going to engage with novices around, you need to have some conception of what justice actually is in practice. I don't think we generally think about justice that way. We don't think of it as a practice or as a set of practices. It is much more, I think, to most of us, a way of thinking. And when we talk with novices, it is usually a set of beliefs or a particular disposition. And one of the things that we know is that you can have a set of beliefs and a particular disposition and still really struggle to do any kind of enactment in classrooms. So I think probably our first step, or my first step, as I thought about how is it I'm going to reframe my own pedagogy with novices, has been actually to specify what practices I think novices need to learn in order to do justice work. And before I get into any of that, I want to say I don't claim at all to have gotten these right, nor do I think that I'm not here to say these are the practices, everybody. This is all very emergent for me. More of what's exciting to me is the different way of approaching the work of preparing novices to do justice work in schools, not actually that I have landed on the right practices at all. So the first part of the work for me has been to specify a set of practices to engage novices in. And the way that I have decided to do that is I've got a book cover here of Dr. James Banks's textbook, Multicultural Education. It's in its 9th edition or some long edition. And the reason I've chosen it is because it's had so many editions. It's a book that is widely used in teacher education programs around the country. So this is a particular approach to thinking about the work of multiculturalism and social justice that gets widely used. So I'm going to latch onto that as one approach, one way to think about the problem, but one might take a completely different framework for thinking about justice and culture to do the work of practice specification. And these are his 5 dimensions of multicultural education that he's identified and worked with now over a set of decades. Content integration, knowledge construction, equity pedagogy, prejudice reduction, and empowering school culture. As dimensions, they're helpful, they're thematic, they help us sort of chunk the work of justice in schools, but they're not practices. I think content integration comes closest to being a thing that you do. If you think about practices as things people habitually do in their professional work, integrating the content of marginalized groups could be considered a practice, but the rest of them are not actually things you do. They're just thematic headings. So what I have done is I've taken these and I've said, okay, I'm going to rephrase these as practices. And you'll see the list there of what those potentially are. And knowledge construction, which is the idea that the knowledge that exists in our texts that we're actually teaching students comes out of biased histories, is developed in biased ways that are embedded in unjust systems. So knowledge itself can be biased, and we need to engage with kids around that idea. So the practice then would be something like posing alternatives, both identifying marginalizing knowledge and then posing alternatives to that knowledge with students. And to get a novice to do that work is actually incredibly complex, right? So the first step in the process of thinking about what it might look like to have a practice-based approach to social justice teaching is actually just to specify a set of practices. Whether these are ones someone else might want to use or not is up for question, but the work of specification itself is a step in a direction towards making a practice-based approach. The next step after actually specifying practices would be then being able to transform both the what, the how, and the where of teacher ed, thinking about new settings, thinking about new pedagogies. And for this work, I've drawn a lot of work on teacher education pedagogy that's coming out of both the University of Washington and elsewhere. The Core Practices Consortium that is now comprised of a whole set of people from Michigan to Washington to Stanford to UCLA, folks from BTR here in Boston. So I'm drawing on a large set of work. This is by no means my own. So you might be, I'm going to go back for one quick second. So let's imagine you have a practice. You've identified a practice. Let's imagine posing alternatives to mainstream marginalizing knowledge. You could say to a novice, right, things we know about professional education are you can't actually just say to somebody, I would like you to go pose alternatives to mainstream marginalizing knowledge now and then have them go out into classrooms and be able to do that work effectively, right? So the pedagogical approach that I'm drawing on out of content-specific instructional methods is one that embeds a practice inside of something that is learnable and enactable. So I'm drawing a lot on something that's come out of mathematics education, which is the idea of the instructional activity. So in mathematics education, particularly out of the learning to teach in, through, and for practice, which is a part of the group Magdalene Lampert, Megan Franke, Ellen Cosme, a whole set of folks who do really exciting work in mathematics education, have developed this tool for professional preparation that they call the instructional activity. And they talk about it as a container that contains both the principles, the knowledge, the practices that they're trying to teach teachers inside of something concrete. So the ideas that they use here to decide on their instructional activities is that all instructional activities that they decide on have footprints in the curriculum, are highly usable inside classrooms, are learnable by novices. They preserve the complexity of teaching, which is actually pretty important to note, because you know there are many service teacher education programs out there that get people to enact activities. But those activities oftentimes, like for example, if you were going to teach novices to use an attention-getting signal, right? That is a part of teaching. It's actually an important part of teaching, because if you don't do that, you can't get your kids' attention. But it's not a practice that has any real complexity, right? It doesn't. You wouldn't look at somebody getting an attention signal and say, oh yes, that person is teaching. So the instructional activities are also containers that, if you were to look at them in their entirety, would be identifiable as teaching. They're large enough and complex enough to hold the complexity of the work of teaching, but yet small enough to be learnable by a novice. So I've tried to take on this idea from mathematics and think to myself, all right, they've done a lot of really exciting things. There's been a lot of promise coming out of their work with novices. What might it look like to create instructional activities for the work of justice? And so my first stab at that is this. And these are all really in development. So just take it all with a grain of salt in some ways. So the practices are here. integrating content, posing alternatives to knowledge, anticipating and responding to prejudice, advocating with students adversely affected by inequities. That then I try to take each of those practices and embed them into a container that is learned by a novice. So, for example, if we're talking again about posing alternatives to mainstream marginalizing knowledge, I would take one example of that a teacher could do, challenge the textbook, an activity in which teachers have to find in whatever it is they're teaching currently a piece of their textbook that in fact presents some set of knowledge that is built out of a history of inequity. For example, in a history classroom, American history classroom, the title of a chapter entitled Westward Expansion, right? It assumes a European perspective, right? It assumes that the movement is happening towards the West. It puts the reader in the position of European. So to get a novice to, one, be able to identify those moments inside their textbooks, and then to give them a really structured protocol for how is it that you plan the moment of, one, pointing out the mainstream marginalizing knowledge, and then two, posing an alternative to that knowledge with students. So step one for me was, okay, how do I specify the practices themselves? Step two was, how do I embed those practices inside of containers that are learnable and that maintain the complexity of teaching, that are highly specified so that even a novice who would really struggle to do most of the work of teaching, because they're very new to the work, could actually try it on and work with it. But then again, just as having the practice doesn't get you very far, having the instructional activity also doesn't get you very far. It doesn't actually help you with enactment, because it really is just a lesson plan in some ways, right? And we all know, anyone who's worked with novices, that if you have a lesson plan and you give it to a novice, it could be the best lesson plan in the world, and it can still totally bomb, right, when they get out there with kids, because they're still just learning the work. So if the instructional activity and the practice are the what of the curriculum, they are what is to be learned, there we still have to figure out the how. What are the pedagogical approaches we're going to use to help novices actually begin to do that work in classrooms? So here I'm going to draw on what we call at the University of Washington the learning cycle. It was built out of a set of work, a lot of people's work, and Morgan McDonald, Elhan Kazmi, and I recently published a little bit about this elsewhere, so if you're interested in learning more about it, you can talk with me after. But this is a pedagogical cycle for preparing novices to actually engage in the practices of teaching. And it begins by actually introducing and learning about the activity. And in that model, a teacher-educator, either provides some kind of representation of the activity to be learned. Now, whether that is a video of another teacher enacting it, a model of a live model the teacher-educator enacts themselves of the activity, sometimes investigation of written cases if representations are difficult to come by, that actually novices get to engage in the work of viewing some kind of model, engaging with a representation, followed by preparing for and rehearsing the activity. So novices are given planning protocols for the activity themselves, and then they have opportunities to approximate the activity in some way, whether that's through a rehearsal, through an opportunity for some sort of sheltered practice that looks different from that, and receive feedback from the teacher-educator. They then go out into the schools and enact the activity themselves with students. And in some cases, one could offer, depending on the context, because this goes back to the where of teacher ed, right? If you're in a situation that allows for mediated fieldwork, teacher-educators can actually co-teach or live coach in the moment with novices. And if not, novices can videotape their own enactment, bring it back to the teacher education classroom, and then engage around the practice of teaching itself. Through the video, through student work that's produced out of the moment, through the writing of reflection. So this is an approach that's widely used in practice-based teacher education in the content areas, mathematics, ELA, literacy, science, etc. So it's been an exciting experiment a little bit for me to think about, well, what would this look like if what we were actually getting folks to work on is justice work? And what's interesting for me is out of many of these moments, these headings are pedagogical practices that a teacher educator might employ. But what is the actually exciting part of the work is the ways in which these moments create opportunities for novices to do some complex thinking. So what I'm not interested in, and what I hope this doesn't, what I would never want something like this to turn into, is a technocratic approach, right, in which you're actually just trying to get someone to go into a classroom and challenge a textbook, right? And good, you have challenged a textbook with fidelity. Check, off to the next thing, right? But that in fact the idea is that by actually getting novices to do the work inside classrooms, opportunities for their thinking arise in some ways that then hopefully won't paralyze them when they get into the classroom, where justice work previously had only been a sort of cognitive exercise and not a professional practice. So the next bit of what I want to do with you is I want to deep dive a little bit into one example of this. And it's going to involve me showing you some clips of my own teaching, which I'm incredibly nervous about. So I hope that you will be kind, but also know that the videos that I've chosen are really just the only videos that I have. So they're not exemplars by any stretch of the imagination. Since we're talking about pedagogy, and since I think one of my major principles around working with novices is to get them to come to understand that teaching is not siloed work, that in fact it's work that we do together, and that it's work that we do collaboratively, and that when we make our practice public, we are in fact doing really transformative work to the work of teaching. I want to also live my own principles around that. But the deep dive that I want to go into is one of the instructional activities that I've created around the practice of anticipating and responding to prejudice. So I created one instructional activity entitled Respectful Language Norming. And so you'll remember when we were at the instructional activity slide, one of the major criteria for something being an instructional activity is that it actually has footprints in the curriculum, that it's actually something teachers do on a regular basis, and that novices would be able to see as a central part of the work of teaching. So trying to build an activity like that, I decided on an activity in which teachers norm with students about their language use in the classroom and what is appropriate and inappropriate for the classroom, something teachers often do, but that rarely gets used as an opportunity to engage students in thinking about histories of oppression, in thinking about prejudice, in thinking about more complex ideas about the language that they use, right? Usually in classrooms it's only you're allowed to say nice things and you're not allowed to say mean things, and when you say a mean thing, I'm gonna, give you a slip and you can go to the principal's office, etc. This is the deep dive we're going to go into. A little bit about it. These instructional activities are all meant to be 10 to 15 minute chunks of work. And they are meant to be things that novices can actually take up and do relatively easily. So this one is you'll see I've got some South Park characters here, Paula Dean, Selena Gomez. This is all meant to be, these are examples that teachers inside the instructional activity would give to students and have students categorize. Are each of these examples disrespectful language? Why? And what would you, are they the same or are they different? What's different about them? So this one here, South Park characters using profanity. This one is a tweet from Twitter. Selena Gomez is on the radio right now. Is there a volume lower than mute? Right, a mean comment. And this one here is a newspaper article about the celebrity chef Paula Dean's use of the N-word. And so the activity itself is students engaging with these three, or for younger grades, teachers come up with different examples, engaging with these three and doing the work themselves of deciding, well, what makes each of these disrespectful? How are they different from one another? And are they the kinds of language we want to see used in our own classroom? So the first thing, if we go back to the learning cycle, right back here, the first thing that I do with novices around this instructional activity is I provide them with a model. If I had really great video models, I would do that, but I don't at the moment, so I just give them a live model of it, and they act as learners. So not as students, but as actual participants, as learners in the moment. And I want to show you just a brief video example of what that looks like. These are all these happen to be Teach for America teachers. So these teachers they've just finished their 5-week summer institute, and they haven't yet started the school year. So they have a very, 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 very small amount of teaching experience. And they're engaging here in a model of the respectful warming activity.
First of all, my group, speak to me. Was it disrespectful? Do you guys say yes? Tell me why.
Why did the all ladies in her sweat that
using curse words? Who wants to add on to that? Another group. Why might using curse words be considered disrespectful?
It's targeted to an audience.
Well, tell me more.
So, I guess, like the first example is celebria. It's directed to a certain population. And the second one is Selena Gomez's example, like it was a personal attack. It was like directed to an individual. But it always has that like target group.
So now we're talking about a whole bunch of those. Selena Gomez, Selena South Park. As she said, they have different targets. She said Selena Shaft is targeted at a group, is that what you said? And then Selena Gomez is targeted at an individual? What about South Park?
So that's my question too. Is it all time?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to write these first ideas down. The first thing I'm hearing from you is South Park's not targeted at anyone in specific. Jay?
I think the difference is that the sludge shift, the language is being used within specific for a certain reason, versus in South Park, it's not marking specific.
Connected to is this what you're saying? Connected to a history of aggression? Wow, I think that Jay just pointed out something really great, and I'm going to highlight it here. The selection was connected to a history of oppression. The other one is not, right? It's just sort of inappropriate. Alright, so let's think of some names for this. Connected to a history of oppression, targeted at an individual.
So that's just a short clip, right? But that is a brief moment of my own model of the activity. So they've looked at the examples, and then we have a discussion. And the point of the activity, sort of on a larger scale, is then they together we create a anchor chart that labels different kinds of language. I think in this class, the 3 labels they came up with were inappropriate, insulting, and prejudiced. In other instances of this, people have come up with different titles, right? But then we have a conversation about when someone says something inappropriate, what's the response going to be? Versus when somebody says something that's prejudiced, what's the response going to be? And we create that norm together. All right. So and so it's meant to be both an activity that helps novices learn about norming and its purpose in the classroom, and an activity that gives novices a way to actually engage in conversations about histories of oppression with students. So the next thing that we then do together is we prepare to enact the activity through a rehearsal. So I have worked with these novices to actually plan it themselves. They've had a planning protocol, which looks like this. It's 2 pages long. It has steps. It gives example things you might say. It's very structured, but it allows for a lot of them to do the own. It's not scripted, but it is structured. So the next thing we do is we prepare for rehearsal. And you'll notice, so in the modeling, I was doing a set of work. In the rehearsal, you'll hear me doing a lot of different types of things. And the reason for that is because I'm trying to help them with the problem of enactment. That's sort of my primary goal during the rehearsal. You'll notice in the debrief later, I have a different primary goal. I'm trying to help them think about the ideas. But unless I give them an opportunity to really actually try on some of the things that make teaching very difficult for novices, they're only going to go into their own classrooms and bomb, which is not what I want. I want to set them up for success.
Yeah,
Good morning, class.
Good morning.
All right, for the next 2 minutes, I want you guys to silently and independently work on your pronouns. Tell me what community means to you and what about it makes you feel safe and respected. And after 2 minutes, I'm going to bring us together and we're going to share out our answers. So you guys have 2 minutes. Go.
So I just want to point out that this section comes right before what you saw me doing. It's the activating background knowledge moment of the activity. So you'll see something slightly different. I also want to apologize for the incredibly poor video quality in this particular video. But also you'll notice here I'm doing a lot of things. I want to just point this out as we go. Because this is the first rehearsal I have ever done with these teachers, you will notice me being very kind. And you will notice me not pointing out a lot of things that I might point out otherwise. In part, that's because I'm trying to create a learning environment for them where they will work with me then for the rest of the year on these types of things. And we can talk about that afterwards, about how rehearsals actually change over time.
So to highlight for everyone, Ashley's doing a really lovely job of talking to somebody when they were slow to start. Leaning down on their level and asking her, what are you with her? She said, let's think about what in that community in particular makes you feel in the same position. And move on to you three. Yes. What might have been different if you had opened it up for more people to give responses? Why did you choose to go with the one response that you already knew?
I want spirit. You want to kind of guide. You want it to seem like you're giving your students a voice, but at the same time, guiding in the right direction of where you want to go. So that way, you're not maybe another answer that would be really good, but maybe not so much like you're told where you're trying to build the lesson.
So what are some things, one thing I want to push us to is getting more student ideas on the table, but I really like the decision you made to use, you knew Jay's response was going to get you exactly where you needed to go. So I wonder if you might want to go with her response last, right? Start with a couple of other things so you get ideas up, and then because you know that Jay's response is going to get you to the next place, end with her. Does that make sense? So you don't know what the other people are going to say. That's one of the things about teaching. You can't control them, right? But you have identified Jay's is going to get you where you need to go. So I want you to try it one more time. Is that this time I want you to ask 2 more people and then figure out how to make the transition to the next thing. Given that you're going to get some ideas, you don't know exactly what they are. Okay? So one more time. So just from the end of the do now. One thing I want to highlight that just happened in the rehearsals was when they opened it up, they actually let go of, the second time around, they let go of control a little more, right? They knew Jay was going to say she was part of the rehearsal, and then I said, you know what, get more ideas on the table, and when they did, you see, they actually got something they weren't expected, and they got it to be a little bit richer, right? And they came over and he noticed, wait a minute, when I opened it up, I got even more things that were going to get me to my next place. So that was lovely, I love seeing that. Great job.
All right, so one thing you'll notice watching the rehearsal is I'm not, in the model, we're talking about history of oppression, we're talking about prejudice. In the rehearsal, mostly what I'm working with them on is how do you run a classroom in a productive way? How do you get student ideas on the table? How do you use those student ideas to push a discussion forward? And then in the earlier part of it, really like, what are some of the just things, when you let students do independent work, what's your job then? A novice doesn't even know that, right? A novice doesn't know it's their job to go to the kids who are slow to start and get those kids to start working in some ways. And then if they knew that was their job, they still wouldn't know how to do it yet, right? So the rehearsal work is really focused on enactment itself, giving them some feedback in the moment about what it looks like to enact these things. So these are the moments where a lesson plan, as good as it was, would still fail if you didn't have real targeted support. So then the third quadrant of the learning cycle, enacting the activity with students, I don't have permissions for videos of students, so I don't have that for you. But this is a poster that came out of a student's classroom, right, that she and her kids created together. So 3 levels of disrespect: rude, mean, connected to histories of oppression. And that then is up on her wall, and she uses it with her kids when language arises and they come back to the norming conversation. It's much like any kind of language norming that teachers do, except it's trying specifically to call out issues of oppression and how it's connected to our language use. And then lastly, this is a video of the rehearsal debrief, not the debrief after enactment, just because of the video that I happen to have. But this part of it, the analysis part, you'll notice also looks quite different than both the model and the rehearsal. We can watch a brief clip of that.
Those pages were really helpful for me, was really setting that up. There is much disagreement with that about whether or not that was offensive. On the other hand, there's no disagreement, on those not saying that's okay, and talking about something that you don't like is offensive. So like having those different, I think those ideas like firmly in the mind and there's a lot of disagreement here. There are classrooms and there's disagreements. On the other hand, there's no disagreement. That's just something that you can really clear out where that falls.
But I think also say like there's no disagreement with it. And I think there are people that disagree in this where they were teachers within TMA in the institute that said that's retarded.
Yeah, it's a difference between a disagreement in the world and there's disagreement in the community that is affected by the language itself, right?
So that's a brief clip, right? But the hope is that out of the work of trying these things on, that in fact then you get people to start having conversations and thinking a little bit about what it is they're actually asking of their students in relationship to language use, which is, I think teachers don't have opportunities to work collaboratively around. So that's a brief sort of snippet of what it looks like around the learning cycle, and hopefully we can, when we open it up in a couple of minutes, have a conversation about what that looks like and what questions it arises, because this is all, for me, it's also incredibly emergent and really new. So these ideas are I want to just close a little bit with some ideas about what I think still needs to be done, because this is all really beginning stages for me. And they fall for me a little bit around both the what, the how, and the where of teacher education in relationship to justice work. So I'm now still asking I have a set of practices that I'm working with, but I don't yet know if those are the practices I'm going to continue working with. And I think my own research actually is a little bit around this, my dissertation research, which is what actually are the practices that teachers do employ that effectively interrupt social inequities. So that's not just, an exercise in my own head trying to come up with it, but actually we go out in the world and figure that out. Some people have done some exciting work around that already. And then 2, what are actually the limitations and affordances of using pedagogies of enactment and focusing on issues of social justice? I think many people worry that if you do that rehearsal work takes a long time. And it's time actually away from some of the critical thinking work because it's really focused on enactment. And so what do you lose when you lose that time? And what do you gain when you use that in a different kind of a way? And then lastly, I haven't yet been using this. I haven't been really wrestling with the where, but I think it raises some interesting questions. I think a lot of people who do work with novices around social justice have done some exciting where work, right, with community walks, etc. But then how does setting actually influence novices' opportunities to learn to enact social justice in their practice? So I want to leave it there in part because all of this work I've been doing, the justice part of it at least, if not the pedagogy part of it, I've been doing very siloed. So it will be great to have an opportunity to talk with all of you about your thoughts and what you're doing here and things you're doing that connect or questions that you have. And I want to thank you all again for having me and for now being able to have a conversation with me. So thanks much to you as well.
Actually, Abina Mackel is your discussant for today, and she'll provide the first 5 minutes of response, and then we'll open it up.
Great.
Thanks so much.
y'all. So I'm Rabena. I'm a second-year doctoral student in CCE, Culture, Communities, and Education. And first of all, I just want to say thank you, Sarah. That was such an interesting talk, and I really appreciated how clearly you went through it. And I'm excited. So I'm just going to say a couple of things, and then we can have just a lively conversation and ask Sarah some more questions. I'm going to toss them out there, but they should be by no means limiting to our discussion. So Sarah began by sort of framing her talk as bridging two worlds, particularly this practice-based teacher education and justice-oriented teacher education. The research question that she proposed was, how do we better prepare novice teachers, and this is my summary of it, but basically to enact, and that was triply emphasized, practices that interrupt and disrupt, inequities, and inequities that particularly lead to disparate educational outcomes for students. I think that in listening to Sarah talk, there were a couple of questions that arose for me. One was around just the terminology, and I hope that you could just clarify a little bit more for us what you mean by social justice, particularly as you see it relating to multicultural education. Banks is that textbook is well established and used very often in multicultural education. But I often notice that there's a slippage in this general field between multiculturalism, between culturally responsive, between social justice, and I'm sort of distilling those different types of pedagogical practices and curricular pedagogical practices as they relate to curriculum might be helpful for us in our further discussion. Additionally, I love this thinking through what we see as ideas around curriculum and pedagogy, but really turning them into distinct practices. And the practices that you put up, I know that you said that they were preliminary, but they were quite clear and seemed to be action-oriented. My question is, however, how do you sort of gain traction within your professional community as well as among your student populations? So how is it that you convince students that this is a worthwhile investment of their time? As a former Teach for America Corps member, I know that the Teach for America preparation often included issues, a couple of discussions that pertained to issues of inequality and race, but they often were not considered to be the important part of our training. And so Corps members would often say, we need to teach the real stuff about teaching. I need to know how I'm going to be able to manage a classroom and write a lesson plan. And so how do you get, one, the Corps members or whoever your students are on board, and then two, how you demonstrate to other faculty that it is important for us to work at the nexus of the justice-based practices as well as the teacher education and sort of even more content-specific practices. And then last, I was interested in the choice to label teachers as novices. I think that what you described to me would be highly applicable to a lot of teachers who have experience in the classroom, and that these practices are not part of the traditional teacher education preparation. And so is it at all limiting to think about this as something that is for novice teachers rather than for teachers writ large? Is there something unique about teachers getting this at the very beginning of their professional career rather than along the line? And how do you, and I think this was the last, I know I said the last, but the second component of that is organizational theory suggests to us that teacher education, pre-service teacher education tends to be quite limiting. That when teachers go into the classroom, they often fall back on what they have learned from being students as well as sort of personally held beliefs, or they fashion their practice off of the practices of their colleagues, right? So teachers learn a lot from the teachers who are in the building with them. And so how do you work with teachers so that they are able to enact these practices and hold on to these beliefs even after they are no longer in a community that perhaps shares these as the most important values. And so those are just some of the things that I thought were quite interesting and would love to hear Sarah talk about. Sarah, if you might respond to a couple of those things and then make sure that there's enough time for questions, that would be great. But it was really great hearing your talk.
Great, thanks so much. I think Kavanagh raises a bunch of really good questions. The first of which, and tell me if I'm forgetting anything, the first of which was, what do I say social justice, what is it that I mean, right? A pretty important question to be asking. And in part I tried to stay, in part because I am working primarily on pedagogy, right? I'm trying to stay a little bit vague because I think the primary thing for us is to think about the pedagogy we use to surround our own particular approach. So one person might be using a multiculturalism approach, another critical multiculturalism, another anti-oppressive, right? But I think actually the pedagogical ideas could attach to each one of those different perspectives. For me, when I talk about social justice teaching, I think very much about, and I think, the way I talk about this still might be vague, but the work of interrupting inequitable disparities that have arisen out of histories of oppression. So that's a lot, right? That exists around that, but I focus really specifically on social groups. So not necessarily inequities that exist between students just because teachers don't like particular students, but actually the inequities that arise out of long histories of oppression related to particular social groups. And what happens, hopefully, inside instructional activities is that emerges out of the work itself and out of the conversations that we have. And you saw that a little bit in the conversation at the end. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but that's my own particular conception. And then Amanda also asked, how do you gain traction? Which is a really great question, and I think it's a perfect question because she talked a little bit about how in her own Teach for America training, but I think this is the case in most teacher training, that conversations about power and prejudice and identity, and people think about them as not the work of teaching, right? They think about them as something that's probably important to think about, but it's not actually really their work. And part of my approach has been to try and centralize it, to embed it in the work of teaching for the teacher so they don't have to do the work of contextualization themselves. It's taking the onus off of the novice to contextualize justice inside practice by offering it to them that way already. So that they come to understand the work of teaching, the practice of teaching, as directly embedded in these kinds of ideas. I think the question of how do you get your colleagues to do that is a different kind of problem, in part because anyone who works in teacher education knows there's already not enough time. Everybody's struggling, everybody's sort of scrambling for their own time. And to steal time, quote unquote, for work particularly around justice, is difficult. So in part, what has been exciting for me, because I'm teaching inside this one alternative program at the University of Washington that's called UACT, which supports our Teach for America teachers, is that we've done a lot of work across content areas and across foundations and content areas to begin to integrate some of this. So we've started to think about what instructional activities might look like if they served both purposes. If they were both an activity that helps mathematics teachers think about teaching math and an activity that helps them think about justice. But I think what's really important for us to pay attention to inside that work is that you actually have to hold on to the expertise around justice and equity. So I don't think one can say, oh, we're going to pass that off to the mathematics folks, because their expertise is in mathematics education, not necessarily in justice and power and identity. And you want to hold on to that expertise, so you want to give novices an opportunity to both do instructional activities with an expert in mathematics education, and perhaps the same one in an environment where they have access to expertise around some different ideas. The other question Amanda asked was, is it limiting to think of this as novices? And I think no, I think yes, actually, it is limiting. I think we could do a lot of work at thinking about what this might look like with more expert teachers, or at least more experienced teachers. My own work is with pre-service teachers, so that's where I do my work. But I think one thing I would imagine is in the context of teachers with experience, your rehearsals would look quite different. You wouldn't be working with them on some of the basic work of teaching. You wouldn't be working with them on how it is that you like get on a kids level and then talk to them. You wouldn't be working on making sure you get kids' ideas on the table. You'd be working with them probably more on some of the more in-depth work around the ideas themselves. So anyway, those are a couple of my answers. I want to make sure I have opportunities to talk about anything else that arose for people out of this talk. Yeah.
This builds on the last vignette you showed us.
Yeah.
One, I really love what you're doing. I'm thinking about the next level, which is it works great in situations where the community agrees on the narrative of oppression. But as that last student started to push back a bit, you can get in situations where the narrative, various narratives of oppression are contested.
Yes.
And how do we negotiate and prepare teachers, which it's easy when everyone in the class agrees this is an oppressed, historically oppressed group and we should combat it. What happens when students start contesting those narratives? I think that really puts even experienced teachers, okay, now I've just gone from frying pan to the fire.
Yeah. I think that raises a really interesting idea for me. In some ways, those of us who teach pre-service teachers in courses like multicultural education courses have for a long time had conversations about the struggle that we have with the fact that you teach these courses and you have a set of people who have either lifetimes of experience with these ideas because of their own identity, or just have done a lot of thinking about it and have some really exciting ways of thinking about it, and mixed in with a bunch of folks who this is the first time they've ever encountered these ideas and they're really resistant to it, and the course, if you don't work unbelievably hard, becomes a course for those people, right? And then everyone else is sort of left to become the teachers of the folks who have thought about these ideas for the very first time. And in some ways, I hope, although I have no idea if this is true yet, right, that an approach that actually allows people opportunities to actually try on the work and take on the work and have conversations around the work itself would give folks who have had lots of opportunity to think about power and identity, opportunities to do something new and exciting that they can learn from without always having to be the teachers of the other people only.
I have that's a really good point. That's a slightly different question. So
Yeah,
I'm thinking about the increasing propensity of groups that, for most progressive educators, are viewed as being privileged groups, adopting the discourse of oppression and co-opting that discourse. So, for example, when I look at religious students.
Yeah.
A lot of conservative evangelical students are increasingly co-opting the discourse of oppression and framing themselves as an oppressed minority.
Yeah.
So, and that's the challenge, is what happens when historically dominant groups realize, okay, the name of the game is to be an oppressed, non-dominant group, and recast themselves in that, and it upsets the apple cart because you're like, wait a minute, you're not actually necessarily in the same context. So in other words, how do we deal with that? But at some point we have to also judge, is this a legitimate claim to oppressed status?
Yeah.
And those questions arise as more groups try to claim that mantle, thereby weaken the power of disruptive inequity.
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to it in relationship to this particular pedagogical approach, but I would imagine it would come up in any pedagogical approach that you're engaging with, right? But I think it's probably a really important question to engage with around this idea. I want to follow it and see where it does come up so that I can, come up with some ideas about that.
And something, just a response to that, I think it's really important when you're talking about oppression. I think it would be really easy to position it in the context of power and social power. And I think that can be something that's really easy to break down. And so in the case of somebody trying to claim an oppressed status, when you can look to the dominant society and say, in the United States, like, where do Christians fall as far as their oppressed status, or like as far as their social power? Does an evangelical Christian not have access to social power because of their religion? Can they choose to not disclose their religion and access other forms of power, like racial power or class power? So I think a lot of times when we talk about that, that worry of people claiming that sort of status, I always wonder how it can be sort of positioned or framed in a way that really acknowledges power and social power. And I think when you bring that to the realm of it gets hard for people to push back against that. And you give that sort of container for it, or context for it.
Yeah.
So I really liked how you started with the idea of practices, and you were putting some important ideas there. How do we tease that out further to get at like what is the particular learning objective, what that skill, and then because you will have, like when Brendan said, all these different conversations will happen, sure, but is there something deeper that we want to get out of core competencies around this idea of social justice? What are the particular key skills? So I like the practices, but for a novice or any other teacher, and then for the sake of like measuring that, like assessing that as a teacher, what am I looking for particularly?
I think those are really, really important next steps, and I think it connects to what both of you were saying, right? Which is, and I'm working now with my folks in the content areas actually, and in my own humanities methods course, which uses a similar model, to be thinking about this, right? How do you identify the content knowledge to be learned? And around this, it would be the content knowledge around justice and power, right? What is the content knowledge to be learned inside each of these activities? And then where is that situated inside the cycle? For myself as the instructor, right? Where do I situate each of those things? If I'm using rehearsal as the opportunity to really probably wouldn't use rehearsal, but if I really want to make sure I get people to an investigation of how it is people get recast, and who counts and why do they count, and what is the framework I'm using to decide who counts and whatever, then how do I make that conversation arise out of the conversation of practice? I think that's a really important next step. Yeah.
Okay. On his question, I wonder what are professional standards for qualified teacher, or some requirements for teacher training perspective of teaching or social justice?
What are the requirements currently? I mean, they're all set out by like state level boards, and mostly what it looks like is just being able to say, I have a multicultural education course. They have this many hours, right? Which that has no depth to it. So all we need to, if we're trying to reframe the pedagogy, it matters little in some ways in relationship to the required content.
Can you specify your school? Government specify some standard?
I think we're more in danger, although I know less about this probably. There are probably people in this room who know a lot more about this. But I think we're probably more in danger of losing any higher level standards than of specifying, than of having the opportunity to specify more. But I don't know much about state level standards or other types of standards that have to be met. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm curious about, you're emphasizing the cognitive aspect in the sort of reflection evaluation analysis, in part because that was the opportunity for students actually to think about the content, in part because clearly you didn't think that they would understand the content well enough, right, on their own. And I'm curious how much of that is an explicit part of the instructional activity work being done by Megan and others. I realize I don't really know, certainly when I was teaching the history methods courses with the introductory and the advanced ones, in a way it just came up especially with the advanced ones, because we weren't doing this kind of core practice work exactly, but even in really trying to think about, well, how do we teach causation or chronology or whatever, we realized, oh my gosh, we don't really understand what historical causation means, right? We don't actually understand how to think about chronology or whatever. And so a lot of so it was an explicit part of our work to realize we need to become better historians, better social scientists, et cetera, in order to teach it to others. And so you had presented it slightly implicitly as being an extra thing or a different thing for the justice work than for the other kind of instructional, sort of more academic content-oriented instructional activity cycle. But I was curious.
I think the trick, I want to just draw on my own work as a history methods teacher for a second to draw the comparison. Yeah. So when I'm doing instructional activities inside a history methods course, one of them, for example, is I teach a humanities methods course, so I'm teaching people who are both teaching English and history. So I'm trying to create instructional activities that work across, which is incredibly difficult.
But one of them that I use is a reading strategy mini lesson, right, which is really prevalent inside ELA. But I use it for teachers to get, when they're doing it in ELA, they do it as a traditional reading strategy mini lesson. And when they do it in history, we do it as a mini lesson on sourcing. So I'm trying, right, and this is all just emergent, but I'm trying to build the instructional activities themselves so that they give me an opportunity to teach the novices actually about a set of historical thinking skills. And I feel like next steps for the justice work is to really be able to identify, okay, inside each of these instructional activities, and this connects back to your question, right? What are the explicit pieces of content that I need them to know? And then where am I going to, in the learning cycle, call attention to each of those? But I think it's imperative that the instructional activity itself makes it easy to do that work. So, like, I heard Deborah Ball talking about, inside the Core Practices Consortium, we're thinking about specifying some things about the learning cycle and pedagogies. And Deborah Ball's real push was to actually begin to specify the work of developing content knowledge for teaching inside of teacher education pedagogies. What are the pedagogies of helping people develop content knowledge for teaching? And I think a lot of us haven't thought so much about, well, what is the content knowledge for teaching about identity, power, and justice that teachers have to have in order to be able to do the work. And I think once you specify some practices, actually, of justice work, you can begin to say, okay, in order to enact this practice, there are a set of things you need to be able to do. You need to not run into the trap of what you had mentioned to us earlier, right? I'm sorry, I don't know your name. But there's some content knowledge you need to know in order to be able to make those concentric circles without putting a really non-historically oppressed group right in the center of it. So I think that's a really important step. I'm not sure if it answers your question.
I mean, it does address the question. It's worrisome. It's not that I'm saying your answer is worrisome. The content of the answer, I mean, it's challenging, right? Because it recognizes this problem that we do in the United States tend to have teachers entering the profession with a fairly weak content base, right? And we're now encountering 2 weak content bases. And we're putting a lot of these instructional activities are having to bear a lot of weight. And they're very, very time consuming, as you pointed out. So you can't do very many of them. And say, thinking about, Liz Kenner and I have been working together more often on these things, and that's entirely my fault, on thinking about instructional activities in history. And it's so hard to figure out ones that are doable, that are manageable, that can be rehearsed, that, and it's very, very difficult. So I think this is as interesting an approach as any, but then when you think, all right, eventually you don't want students to put on their hat and say, okay, am I doing a justice instructional activity or am I doing a math instructional activity? But you instead want them to do a justice enacting math activity.
Yes.
Which is hard.
And it's hard at the level of development, too, because it requires those of us who work in teacher education to have opportunities to collaborate on our teaching. We don't even have opportunities to collaborate, in areas that are maybe more esteemed in some ways. And to find that time is really difficult. It's a hard task. Yes?
Yes, I have a question. I'm not in your field, and I actually couldn't hear the audio very well.
I know. I realized I subtitled the students and not myself.
Yeah, so that's okay. But how do you, the examples that I was able to perceive were largely about personal injury. And in fact, a lot of discussion, my experience from teaching college in the U.S. is that young Americans focus a lot on personal injury for good reason. But that does not necessarily enable one to move very easily towards the kind of issues you're talking about. So how, when these questions of assault, science, and all of this, how do you link that then to, in practice, to larger issues of labor markets, historical inequity, etc.?
I think a couple of things.
Without boring them.
Well, I think a couple of things. I think one of the things is that part of this particular instructional activity is meant to help students see the difference in some ways between personal injury and something that's connected to a larger history. So that's part of it. I don't know how well it does that or not. But another thing I think is that I have moved in my own teaching away in some ways, and maybe this is for good or for bad, but from really focusing on really broad contextual ideas, with novices in particular. In part because I'm trying to get them ready to do the problem of enactment, and this is connected in some ways to what you were saying, because it does require us to limit the scope. I don't know if I were working with experienced teachers, if I would then limit the scope as much, but with novices who are getting prepared to do their enter into teaching, I think my experience is that one of the reasons why novices see the justice work as not teaching is because we as teacher educators have sometimes done a poor job of connecting it to their teaching. And so I think I found often that when I go big and broad and talk about the larger causes of the inequities that we are talking about, I lose the relevance to the classroom work. So it has meant that I've had to really limit the scope of what I'm doing with the novices. But it has allowed me then to think about what it is they can actually do in the context of classrooms. But it does come a little bit at the cost of being able to really get them to develop sophisticated frameworks for thinking about justice and inequity, especially in maybe their very first year teaching. So it's a limitation, I think, of the method. Yeah.
I'm still grappling with this in my mind, but I'm kind of interested in what you see the purpose of teaching in general and then in the purpose specifically of teaching history is, and how fundamental that is for kind of really taking on board your model. Mm-hmm. And so I'm English and I was a history teacher, and I've just recently been looking through syllabuses for teaching, training novice teachers in the UK, where the assumption there's much less discourse around social justice and much more about training kids to be critical thinkers and mini historians, if you like, to the service of them being more thoughtful and critically appraising injustice, etc. It's like a much more through the side door of social justice. And I'm just wondering, what would it look like if we used your kind of model, which I think is very compelling, but there was a bit more de-emphasis on the social justice, and you were enacting getting kids to think critically about sources and this and that, or account for diversity and historical perspective. How can somebody tweak what you're doing if they're coming at it in a cultural context, I guess, is where
Are you asking if they were thinking about doing work to prepare people to be history teachers?
Yeah, for example, you had to use the example of your backgrounds in history teaching, for example, and you've also spoken about using discipline-specific pedagogical tools, etc. How does that?
So right now, I teach two totally different courses. One is preparing novices to be humanities teachers, ELA and history teachers, and one is this. And this is a much smaller part of my work, actually. And in that world, in the world of the history teacher preparation, I'm focusing really on critical thinking and getting kids to read historical texts and make claims or grounding patterns and all of that, and much less of this. And I would hope that we could one day come to a place where our work as teacher educators is much more collaborative, so we could do that work simultaneously. But we're not in that place right now. But the instructional activities I use in history teaching are my ELA novices. The instructional activities are things like reading strategy mini lesson, interactive close read. They're not these types of things.
Yeah, I guess the purpose that you're trying to achieve in each of your courses would affect the balance, I guess, of the way in which you're bringing these two.
Yeah.
I just wonder if if you thought about the level of scale, kind of to what the question before was just asking, if you have a sense of you want people to walk away and at least do this and think this in the classroom, just personally, do you have that sense of whether or not they explicitly address social justice or whether they just are more in their teaching practice automatically incorporate student opinions and voice, which would, to a smaller degree, naturally upset the idea of the teacher as a holder of all the knowledge. So I wonder if there's a scale up effect that you see as a possibility for how teachers might enact these kind of does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, tell me if I'm right, but one of the ways in which I'm interpreting your question is that on a very basic level, one of the things we know, one of the biggest inequities in schooling, right, is that kids who come from the marginalized low-income community, students of color, their voice never gets heard in the classroom. They are never asked to engage. They're never asked to, put their ideas on the table and work with those ideas, and that is an incredible injustice and inequity. That work, that particular idea tends to get addressed, at least in the program that I work in the content areas. The instructional activities inside the content areas are all totally focused around discourse. So the work that I'm taking on inside of the justice program is work that sits primarily outside of the content work, because I know it's not being addressed inside the content areas. But there are a set of things about justice that are totally addressed inside those areas, and so I don't take them on. But I think if I were working in a program in which I didn't have the same kind of faith in the work that's happening in the content areas, then I would want to make sure I took that on myself.
Can I follow up on that? Because I guess that sort of relates back to my thinking about this synthetically, in that, say, as you work with students on, a read aloud instructional activity, or on sourcing, or whatever it is, how you do a mini lesson and interactive lecture, ideally, students are going to learn how to do those things in ways that, say, employs students' cultural patterns of participation, right? And looking back at your reconceptualizing of mixed dimensions and multicultural education as practice. They will do it by integrating content representing marginalized groups. They will do it by presenting alternatives to marginalized knowledge. And so I'm curious about the choice to pull out these separate instructional practices.
I think one of the reasons why I have done it is that there are a set of things that I think content area folks know a lot about. They know a lot of really smart folks in the content areas know a lot about how to get kids' ideas on the table, how to work with those ideas, about how to get kids who have traditionally never been asked to make sense of work, to actually do the work of making sense of content. But there are a set of things related to justice that actually don't sit inside of content teaching, which I would argue should be central parts of teaching itself. So work around advocating for kids, or being activists inside your school context to fight particular inequities, or working with kids to address prejudice that exists inside the classroom. Those things, I think, don't emerge in organic ways inside of the ways that people create their content-specific work in the content area. So that's why I've taken them up here, and not some of the other really central pieces of justice that don't get addressed inside content areas.
I feel like the girls need it, so I think I should say thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. It was great.